Hi and welcome to part 3. So, on the same day that the Beatles released Rubber Soul, they also released a double A single featuring Day Tripper on one side and We Can Work It Out on the other. Day Tripper is just a really great up-tempo rock song with a great rhythm driven by a guitar riff which was definitely the best guitar riff they ever did. We Can Work It Out was their most complex recording to date and was one of the best songs to come out of the Rubber Soul sessions. Like the songs on Rubber Soul, this song has the spirit of their earlier work, except displayed in a more mature way and combined with a unique arrangement and sound. Their next single was Paperback Writer, one that foreshadowed the hard rock genre. The guitar riff at the beginning of the song was louder than just about anything else that was around at the time. It also has a terrific bass line, and overall it's one of their best rockers to date. But despite the brilliance of Paperback Writer, this is one of those singles where the B-side is actually superior to the A-side. I would describe Rain as being like taking one of their early songs and dipping it in acid. In terms of its melody and the vocals on this song, it sounds a lot like early hits like A Hard Day's Night and I Should Have Known Better. But the way the instruments were played and the production of this song gave this song this droning noise to it that sounded unlike anything the Beatles had made to date. It's from this single onwards that the Beatles' sound started to change and evolve at the rate of knots. While their sound did change significantly between 1962 and 1965, it happened very gradually compared with their last 5 years. For example, the folk rock genre that we most associate with Rubber Soul was already starting to show up in their music as early as Beatles for Sale, while those rock and roll songs that appear on their early albums continued to show up as late as Help. But in these last 5 years, every record they made sounded completely unlike their previous record. And so we come to Revolver. This album is often praised for its creativity, innovation, and for sounding unlike anything that came before. But that's not all that makes this album a masterpiece. In fact, if that was all it had going for it, this album would have been like a movie that had amazing special effects but a really dull story. And I'd much rather see a low budget film with an amazing story than a movie that looks brilliant but doesn't have a good story. Similarly, to make really great music, you have to master the basics first, which is why the only song that I'm not particularly crazy about is Love You Too, because while it sounds different from any other song on the album, or any song they've previously done, it's just unique. There's nothing much happening in the melody, there's nothing special about the vocals, it just has a unique sound. But you could take any other song on the album, keep the melody and lyrics the same, but change the arrangement to sound like one of their early songs, and it would still be a really great song. And if you did it with the whole album, you would still have their most consistent collection of songs to date. But what would be missing is the diversity between these songs, and I think it's the combination of consistency and diversity that makes this album incredible. Every song has a quality or a feel to it that distinguishes it from any other song on the album. So when we're listening to this album and we reach a particular song, there's always something new to obsess over. The level of consistency and diversity is what we would expect from a greatest hits album spanning a 10+ year career. So the material they managed to come up with in just 8 months is insane. And the other insane thing about the album is the level of growth they experienced in such a short amount of time. It's ridiculous to think that this is the same band that less than 4 years ago recorded something as lame as Love Me Do. Not that Love Me Do was completely lame, but compared to Revolver, like, there is no comparison. There is so much to talk about, so let's go through all the songs one by one. Taxman is just pure hard rock at its best, with a stinging guitar track and a great lead vocal, and like Drive My Car from Rubber Soul, this song makes it clear right from the start that this album is going to sound unlike anything else. Eleanor Rigby marked several firsts for the band. It was the first Beatles song to be told entirely in the third person, and it's the first Beatles song to contain none of the fundamental instruments associated with rock music. And it was the first song where none of the Beatles played any instruments. All these things make this one of their most unique songs so far, and combined with the distinctive melody and another brilliant vocal from Paul McCartney, makes this one of their best songs to date. I'm Only Sleeping has a beautiful melody and beautiful vocals, but it's beautiful in a very haunting way, which makes this song very unique. I've already said all I need to say about Love You Too, so let's move on to Here, There and Everywhere, which is another beautiful ballad from Paul McCartney. It doesn't quite match Yesterday, but that's not really a problem, especially since it has a very different sound with its backing vocals and lead guitar parts. Yellow Submarine is not one of their best songs, but it works very well in the context of this album. One of this album's main strengths is that it takes you on a journey through so many different moods and tones, from the droning psychedelics of I'm Only Sleeping to the beautiful softness of Here, There and Everywhere. We now reach the playful spirit of Yellow Submarine. And as a song about living in a submarine sung by Ringo Starr, this song had no hope of matching songs like Eleanor Rigby and Here, There and Everywhere, but it's still brilliantly executed and it succeeds in keeping you engaged and interested. She Said is brilliant. The recording is very much rooted in the same spirit that made their early music great, but the arrangement of the song with its stinging guitars and unique drum patterns is miles away from their early music. Good Day Sunshine is a really great, upbeat, feel-good song with another unique arrangement which is primarily the result of the piano track. Angel Bird Can Sing features the Beatles playing with the same level of energy as She Loves You, only now we have the loud electric guitars played by Paul McCartney and George Harrison, and a really full sounding production. The melody and lyrics may have been leaning towards those early love songs, but the song's sound is so unlike anything they were making in their early years. For No One is amazing. It has brilliant vocals, superb melody, tremendous arrangement, incredible sound, just brilliant. Dr. Robert is just pure rock and roll at its best. It probably was one of the weakest songs on the album, but it's still got a great guitar riff, great spirit, and it still sounds amazing. I mean, that's one of the things that every song on this album has. Virtually every song sounds incredible, even by today's standards, but especially for its time. I Want to Tell You is yet another brilliant song. So much spirit, and that bluesy guitar that drives this song is really great. Got to Get You Into My Life is one of the best songs of this album. Well, it's probably not the best song on the album. I think that of all the songs on this album, this song stood the best chance of topping the charts as a single. This song is a combination of Motown influenced R&B and pure rock. It's one of the most joyful songs on the album with its raucous vocals and a rhythm that you can headbang to. Tomorrow Never Knows was by far the most heavily experimental and innovative song on the album, with its psychedelic overdubs, tape loops, backward tapes, and zero chord changes. However, of all the songs on this album, this song was in most danger of having that problem that I mentioned about films that have amazing special effects but a weak story. The question we have to ask is, if we strip this back to a simple drum-bass guitar song, would this still be great? And the answer is yes, because regardless of all those innovative tape loops, backward tapes and all that, the most crucial element of this song is John Lennon's vocal. Is this the best song on the album? That's a really tricky question. I think it's definitely in the top 4 alongside Eleanor Rigby, Here, There and Everywhere and For No One. But ranking those 4 songs is so difficult because they're all so brilliant in their own way. This album is one of the greatest of all time, not because it has some of the greatest songs of all time, but because it tops every other album in history in terms of consistency and diversity, while making these songs feel like they belong together. This album's sound is incredible, and even the songs that don't master the basics at least satisfy the basics. This album was not just a milestone for the band, but a milestone for popular music in general, and it was undoubtedly their best and most outstanding album to date. Their next record was a double A single featuring Strawberry Fields Forever on one side and Penny Lane on the other. Both these songs reflected on the lead singer's childhood growing up in Liverpool, and so they were some of the most personal songs in the Beatles' catalogue, and this translated into two very emotional performances. Strawberry Fields Forever began as a simple acoustic ballad, and right from that first demo, John Lennon was singing with so much conviction, and it was just a beautiful song. And after he played it to the Beatles, they did a huge amount of experimentation, which turned a beautiful acoustic ballad into a psychedelic masterpiece. It's always a bit of a risk making changes to a song that is already great, but the reason this song worked is because it was so brilliant at its core that no matter what arrangement they used, the song was guaranteed to be a success. What ultimately made this song great was its melody and John Lennon's vocals. Everything else was a bonus, but what a bonus it was. This song was their most outstanding studio effort to date, and their most complex production to date, especially since they had to edit together two takes that were at different tempos and keys. Penny Lane was another superb song. The melody and structure of this song was one of their very best. Paul McCartney delivers a perfect vocal with so much emotion, and it was another very complex and superb studio production. In fact, I think this song is more perfect than Strawberry Fields. That having been said, the emotion in John Lennon's voice on Strawberry Fields cannot be topped, and there are moments in the melody that are just magic. So while I think Penny Lane was more perfect, I think Strawberry Fields was more outstanding. Overall, I think Strawberry Fields was the better of the two. Sgt Pepper's was another phenomenal effort from the group. This album was groundbreaking on so many levels. It fully realized the idea of an album being more than just a collection of songs. It was the first concept album, even if the concept was quite loose, and the songs sounded unlike anything that came before, but more importantly, it reinvented pop music as an art form rather than just an entertainment form. When I first heard this album, it was between my first and second listenings of Revolver, and it wasn't until my second listening of Revolver that I really became amazed by it. So, after listening to Sgt Pepper for the first time, I had no reason to dispute that this was the greatest album ever made. But when I heard Revolver for the second time, I realized that Sgt Pepper just didn't blow my mind in the same way that Revolver did. There were certainly outstanding moments on the album, but it didn't seem to have the same consistency that Revolver did. I can see why at the time the album was released, every song on the album probably seemed like the best freaking thing in the universe. When they made this album, they invented a new approach to making popular music, and like when a new genre is invented, no one really had anything to compare this album to, so they naturally thought every song on the album was amazing. But this album has inspired tons of other artists, and I think a lot of the music that this album has influenced is better than a lot of the songs on this album. And what that means is that some of the songs have not aged that well. And I think the difference between this album and Revolver is that not only was Revolver groundbreaking and hugely influential, but the music that is influenced by this album rarely tops the music on this album, and that is not so much the case on Sgt Pepper. I praised Rubber Soul and Revolver for not losing those qualities that made them great in their early years, but one of the most groundbreaking things about Sgt Pepper is that what made the album great was different to what made pretty much every previous album or song in history great. And I think the Beatles got a little caught up in the production of this album and in trying to fulfill the concept of becoming this alter ego band, that at times they forgot to master the basics, or rather they forgot to master the fundamental qualities that made them great in their early years. And I think this was partially deliberate. I think they wanted this album to be great for different reasons to what made their previous music great. And again, I understand why at the time no one would have had a problem with them losing some of those qualities, because the qualities that this album did have were freaking amazing. But as someone listening to the Beatles' music in 2014, I find that the Beatles shone more when their music was driven by the qualities that made them great in their early years, rather than the groundbreaking qualities that drove this album. Ultimately, this album has not stood the test of time as well as a lot of their other music. All that having been said, however, most of what I've just said only really applies to just over half the album, and most of the songs are really excellent. It's just that most of them don't meet the expectations that I would expect from the greatest album ever made. And I find that many of the songs on this album, including the great ones, are easily topped by other songs in their catalogue that are in a similar league. However, all that having been said, there are some reasons besides how groundbreaking this album was why we may consider this to be the Beatles' best album. Firstly, it truly feels like a complete statement. The first song on the album doesn't really work as a standalone song, but it works very well as the introduction to the album. And the way it leads into the second track is amazing. I can't really describe it to you, you really just have to hear it for yourself. Then, just before the final song, the opening track reprises, because part of this album's concept was that it was attempting to substitute for a live performance, and Paul McCartney would always give a parting message just before the final song. So the opening track reprises, and then it leads into A Day in the Life, and not only is the transition so superb, but the first 12 seconds of A Day in the Life is possibly the best opening to a song I've ever heard. And this leads me into the second reason why we may consider Sgt Pepper's to be their best album, which is that it has A Day in the Life on it. You wouldn't normally regard an album so highly just because of one song, but when you listen to this album and reach the end of A Day in the Life, you're left feeling like you've just heard the greatest album ever made. It's like that one song made up for any weak moments that occurred during the rest of the album. And it's worth listening to those less good songs in order to get to the centerpiece, which is A Day in the Life. A Day in the Life begins with that beautiful acoustic guitar playing, and when the piano comes in, the combination of the guitar and the piano creates this amazing sound that never fails to give you chills. Then John Lennon delivers arguably his best vocal, and then 2 minutes into the song, we get this huge orchestral piece which leads into Paul McCartney's section, which isn't as brilliant, but it gave this song a place to go, so it wasn't staying in the same place the whole time. Overall, this is one of the few songs in history that can be considered a masterpiece. I think this is an album that starts brilliantly and ends brilliantly. It's in the middle of this album that I think it sort of drops off a little bit in quality, and it doesn't really return to form until the final song. After the first two tracks, we have Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which is really excellent. Although, if we ranked it with the songs on Revolver, this song would probably be about in the middle, so I do expect one of the best songs on the greatest album of all time to be a little bit better than this. Getting Better is not one of the more highly praised songs on this album, probably because it's a little more conventional than most of the other songs, and it's one of the few songs on the album that is driven by the same spirit that made their early music great. But that's actually why I think it's one of the best songs on the album. Fixing a Hole is good, but not great. It's performed very well, but there's nothing that makes it really stand out except maybe the guitar solo. She's Leaving Home is a terrific mid-tempo ballad with a great sound, although it does fail to match the emotion of Here, There and Everywhere and Yesterday, but at least it has a terrific sound. The next best song is Been for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, and I think everything that I said about the songs not aging very well and them not mastering the basics, etc., that applies to this song more than any other song. The melody is boring and the vocals are nothing special. Instead, the Beatles relied on the psychedelic arrangement and the production to carry this song, and at the time that may have been okay, but this really hasn't stood the test of time for me. Within You Without You was another Indian influenced song from George Harrison. His first attempt at a heavily Indian influenced song was Love You Too, and it was pretty average. This song was better. It had a great melody, a great vocal from George Harrison, and a great arrangement. When I'm 64 is usually considered one of the weaker songs on this album because it was very simple compared with the other songs on the album. I do think it's one of the weakest songs, but it did bring some much needed variety, and so I think of this song in a similar light to Yellow Submarine. It wasn't an amazing song, but it was performed very well, and given that it wasn't meant to be an amazing song, I can't really fault it. And I actually think this song is a little bit better than Yellow Submarine. Lovely Rita is also not one of the best songs in the album, but it has great spirit, and so it's hard not to at least like this song. Good Morning is quite similar to Lovely Rita. I think it's got a lot of spirit and I like the melody, but we've basically had 3 songs in a row that are on the level of good to somewhat great, and that's fine, but isn't this supposed to be the greatest album ever made? So, this album is clearly not as consistent as Revolver, but the best moments on Sgt Pepper make you feel like you're listening to the greatest album ever made. And I see why this is the more obvious choice for the greatest album ever made. Basically, it comes down to this. Either we consider Revolver to be better because of its consistency, or we consider Sgt Pepper to be better because of its structure. I think Revolver is the better of the two, but I also think that Sgt Pepper best represents the Beatles' peak in terms of songwriting, creativity, and musicianship. I think what would have really helped Sgt Pepper would have been the inclusion of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. If they had placed those songs in the middle of this album and taken away 2 of the weakest songs, I probably would have been leaning towards Sgt Pepper being better than Revolver. But as it stands, I consider Revolver to be the best album the Beatles ever made.